Picture 80,000 pounds of steel, glass, and cargo, thundering down a crowded interstate at 70 miles per hour. That is enough raw kinetic energy to effortlessly flatten a concrete highway barrier or crush a passenger vehicle into an unrecognizable mass of metal. Yet the person controlling this incredible force is sitting comfortably in an air-cushioned seat. They have one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel. They might even be sipping a cup of coffee. When I glance at the dashboard, the primary and secondary air pressure gauges hold perfectly steady at 120 pounds per square inch. The mechanical Leviathan obeys smoothly and predictably. At this exact moment, the driver feels a sense of absolute, unquestionable authority. But this control is a delicate, terrifying illusion. It relies entirely on an invisible force flowing through a complex, fragile maze of rubber hoses, steel valves, and metal chambers. Down underneath the trailer, in a dark place where the driver cannot see, hear, or feel it, that invisible force is starting to escape. The entire braking system has a fatal vulnerability engineered right into it. A microscopic crack in a rigid plastic airline has just surrendered to years of constant vibration and extreme heat. Our tiny leak, perhaps no wider than the tip of a sewing needle, is silently bleeding compressed air out into the atmosphere. Inside the cab, the violent rush of highway wind and the roar of the massive diesel engine completely drown out the quiet hiss. This split-screen fluid dynamic chart shows the high-stakes mechanical tug-of-war happening under the hood. The compressor senses the slight drop in pressure and kicks on, pumping fresh air to replace the exact amount bleeding out through that microscopic crack. As long as the compressor can mathematically outpace the tiny leak, the vehicle actively hides its own impending failure. The brakes respond instantly, the gauges read normal, and the illusion remains intact. The highway climbs through the mountains, and then the horizon drops away. The truck reaches the crest of a steep 5-mile downward grade. Gravity immediately takes hold, pulling the 80,000-pound machine downhill, eager to accelerate. To manage their descent, the driver relies on an essential technique called snubbing. They apply the brakes firmly, slowing the truck down by 5 miles per hour, and then release the pedal to let the drums cool. But every single time they release that pedal, the massive volume of air used to slow the truck is permanently dumped out into the atmosphere. This cross-section of a heavy metal brake chamber shows how a semi-truck actually stops. Unlike your personal car, where your foot pushes uncompressible hydraulic fluid directly to the wheels, a heavy truck uses air. When the driver presses the brake pedal, they aren't physically pushing the brakes. They are simply opening an electronic valve, allowing highly pressurized air to rush in and violently force the brake shoes outward. And this same diagram reveals the counterintuitive engineering secret hiding inside every wheel. Behind the air chamber sits an incredibly powerful coil of steel called a spring brake. This spring pushes the brake pads against the drum with thousands of pounds of raw mechanical force. Right now, at highway speeds, that pressurized air acts like an invisible hand, holding back the heavy steel spring and keeping the brakes off. The system's air pressure performs two simultaneous jobs. It creates the friction needed to stop the truck, while acting as the only physical barrier holding back a loaded mechanical weapon. Back on the mountain pass, the overworked compressor hits its physical limit. It has been running at maximum capacity for miles just to keep up with the microscopic crack. Now, forced to replace the massive amounts of air being actively dumped during the descent, the math finally flips. The system is bleeding out faster than it can heal. Inside the cab, the driver glances down at the dashboard. The primary air gauge is no longer resting comfortably at 120. It has dropped to 90, then 80. The driver releases the pedal for a sweeping curve. The needle collapses to 70, 60 pounds per square inch. A piercing, high-pitched alarm begins screaming from the dashboard. Panic sets in. The driver presses the brake pedal hard, desperate to bring the massive machine to a complete stop on the shoulder. But the severely compromised air pressure lacks the violent force needed to push the brake shoes firmly against the drums. This thermal data visualization tracks the immediate chain reaction. The brakes apply weakly, dragging against the spinning metal instead of clamping down. The friction at the wheels creates extreme localized heat. Within moments, the contact point shifts from cold to over 800 degrees of glowing, intense heat. At these extreme temperatures, the physical chemistry of the brake pads begins to actively self-destruct. The synthetic resin binding the heavy friction material together melts and vaporizes. This off-gassing creates a microscopic layer of hot vapor. Trapped between the brake shoe and the metal drum, the porous friction material glazes over, turning as hard and smooth as glass. This is the molecular destruction known as brake fade. Even if the driver miraculously regained a full tank of air pressure right at this exact second, it would not matter. The intense heat has chemically altered the physical brakes, leaving them entirely dead. The needle on the dashboard drops to 40 pounds per square inch. With a violent crack, the pop-out valves on the dashboard violently shoot outward. The final failsafe mechanism triggers, ripping all remaining control away from the driver. The invisible hand completely gives out. The dying air pressure is no longer mathematically strong enough to hold back the system. With a terrifying shudder that rocks the entire vehicle, the massive coiled steel springs deploy automatically, snapping forward. The heavy steel springs forcefully slam the newly glazed, smooth brake shoes against the glowing red-hot metal drums. They slide uselessly against each other. There is absolutely zero friction left to give. The truck does not stop. It accelerates. 80,000 pounds of steel, cargo, and fuel officially becomes an unguided missile. A microscopic, invisible leak successfully drained the lifeblood of the engineering. The resulting heat destroyed the mechanical friction, leaving the laws of gravity in absolute control. The next time you are driving your car next to a loaded 18-wheeler pulling up to a stoplight, roll your window down. Listen closely for the sharp, familiar hiss of the air brakes exhausting into the atmosphere. That sharp hiss is the exact sound of a loaded mechanical weapon being actively restrained. The hidden truth of heavy machinery is deeply unsettling. The massive system designed to stop the truck is actually the exact same mechanism required to let it move. Air pressure grants the vehicle permission to roll, and that permission exists entirely on a razor-thin mathematical margin.